Good afternoon. Welcome to the April meeting of the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society. My name is Jonathan Stair and I'm the president. And I'd like to know if anybody's here for the first time, never been here before. You want to give us your name? Where you're from? Oh, you've been here before.
I have not.
Did you speak to us once?
No.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Harvey. Tell us. I know what you were helping us at Camp Security.
That's right.
That's where I remember. Okay, go ahead. Tell us about yourself.
About myself.
Or what your research interests are.
Well, I have a great grandfather who was in the Civil War. He wasn't drafted though, but he was in the 130th and 195th.
Okay. All right, so I'm glad the rest of you have been with us previously. I should mention that if you came for the presentation on state prison records, we swapped because Mr. Stump, who had a family obligation this month, so he and I swapped. That way he could attend that. And last month he did his presentation, which Nicole, am I correct? That can be seen on the History Center's website if you missed that. And we're thinking about having him come back again. So we'll have other opportunities to hear from him. This time I'm going to ask Richard Robinstein to read the minutes from last month's meeting.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jonathan read or opened the last meeting. We had 3 new attendees. I read the minutes of the last February 5th program minutes. Margaret Berg gave the treasury report. The balance for January 31st was $15,811.50. She went over the receipts with the total cash balance of February 28th. 2023 is $15,927.92. $15,927.92. The membership stands at that point at 134. Nicole with spotlight upcoming events and activities for the month, mainly the distinguished speaker series this month, which would be Eric Larson. And he'll be at the Pell Center for the Performing Arts on April 15th at 2021. Yeah, April 18th, 2023 at 8 p.m. The president just reiterated some of the upcoming events and that the bylaws have been approved or approved last meeting, as well as this meeting was slated for the nominations of officers for the upcoming year. We'll discuss more of that later. And Vice President Richard Kunkel went over future programs and upcoming reasons for the meeting location change, which is due to the History Center moving next year, and next year's program will be finalized in the summer.
Thank you. Margaret, treasurer's report.
Okay, the balance at February 28, 2023 was $15,927.92. Receipts for the month: membership renewals $95, new members $190, publication sales $128, and seminar registration at the Senior Center in Southern New York County $260. Total receipts is $673. Disbursements was speaker fee to the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation for Tyler Stump's speech that he gave here, $125. Net cash balance at March 31st is $16,475.92. Membership is 140. We had 2 renewals, one of them paying for 2 years, and we had 4 new members, 2 of them paying for 2 years. And that's it.
Thank you. Nicole?
Hello, everyone. It's excellent to meet you all today and such a nice crowd. Just a couple of quick announcements before we get started. A reminder that all of our programs are being recorded and will be available on the York County History Center YouTube channel in the future. And as Richard said, we are having a speaker, famous speaker, author Eric Larson will be speaking at the Appel Center on April 18th for our Distinguished Speaker Series. On April 19th, Wednesday, is our Civil War Roundtable. The speaker is Samantha Dorn. She'll be speaking about USCT troops at Lebanon Cemetery. And our all-vet speaker on April 26th, Wednesday, is Dr. Ben Hoover, who is an Army veteran. For more information about all of our programs, please visit yorkhistorycenter.org. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Nicole. We do have a few items of business this afternoon. As Richard mentioned, last month we presented the revisions to the bylaws, and this month we have to vote on them. So they've been posted on the website. I think we had something in the newsletter about it, so you should be aware of that. They'll have a motion to accept the revised bylaws.
I'll make a motion.
Okay, second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, motion passes. It's my duty as the president to announce the ballot of officers for the upcoming year. And the ballot stands as follows. For treasurer will be Margaret Berg, recording secretary Richard Robinstein, corresponding secretary Becky Ann Stein. Unfortunately, Mindy Sowers has an ongoing medical condition which will prevent her from serving another term on the board. So we are looking for another person to serve as director at large. If you would like to serve in that position, and we still need a director of public relations, if you'd like to fill any of this, either of those positions, let me know. Or if you would like to be president, I make this offer every meeting. If you'd like to be president, I will advocate you, and I will fill one of those positions, and you can be up here to be the trained monkey to do the programs. We will vote on that ballot of officers at the June meeting. And also, if in the meantime, we're able to draft somebody, an additional director at large or a public director of public relations, that will be on the June ballot as well. At our board meeting last month, we formed a 50th anniversary committee. This organization will be celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2025. And we want to do something really big. And so we're starting to think about that, getting ideas, putting things together. The chairperson of that committee is Margaret Berg, and she's assisted by Richard Kunkel. And Mindy Sowers has agreed to at least serve on that committee. We're grateful for that. I do want to thank Mindy for her contributions to the board. She's been a member, I don't know how many years, decades of this organization. She has a good institutional memory, which has been valuable to us. So thank her for that. I do want to mention something I mentioned last month. There will be an archaeological dig out the side of Camp Security starting in about 6 weeks. If you would like to participate in that, go to the website of the Friends of Camp Security, which is campsecurity.org, and there's information on there how to sign up. They are looking for more excavators, and you can commit as much time as you want or as little, even if you just can do one morning or one afternoon during that whole period, that would be fine. Richard Kunkel is not here this afternoon. He thought it was more important to be playing in the symphony at York College than to be with us. So it's his loss, but he asked me to talk about upcoming programs. Next month, the first Sunday in May, we're hoping for great weather because we are going to have our meeting down at St. Luke's Cemetery in Chancellor Township, which is along Burkholder Road. And that will be led by June Lloyd and Gene Robinson. It's a repeat of a program they did for their 250th anniversary, 200th anniversary. And then in June, just towards the end of the next archaeological dig at Camp Security, the Chief Archaeologist John Crawler will be here to talk about the latest findings at Camp Security. So you certainly want to be here for that. Now, our speaker today, unfortunately, is me. As I mentioned, my name is Jonathan Stair. I'm the president here. I also worked at the Pennsylvania State Archive for 35 years. I'm on the board of the Friends of Camp Security, and the thing that got me involved in this topic, you should see in a second. So I've been researching Pennsylvania Civil War contractor subjectors for almost 40 years. And I saw some people come in after we got started. I have some extra handouts. Does anybody need a handout before we get started? I'll get it. Anybody else? That's all right. Thank you.
We want two, please.
You know them back there? Well, that's not a sign to go to sleep. I always just enjoy when I went to conferences and they'd sign me the first second after lunch. You can just guarantee you that all heads were going just like that. I did want to mention one of my best friends is here this afternoon, Darryl McCleary, sitting right there in the middle. He's interested in the McCleary family of Southern York County, and he can tell you a lot about those people. Well, like the biblical account of human history, it all started with Adam. I'm the son of George Edward Stair, who's the baby in this picture, who was the son of Arthur Vernon Stair, who was the son of Edward Hartman Stair, who was the son of David Brollier Stair, who was the son of Adam Stair of South Woodbury Township, Bedford County, who was a contractor subject during the Civil War. And it's this document that's housed in the state archives that got me interested, first of all, in contractor subjection during the Civil War, because when I first discovered this, I thought there was very little available about it. As you see, there's a good bit of information. But to understand contractor subjection in Civil War, you have to understand the Civil War draft records. And so for about the past 40 years, I've been sniffing around in draft records, particularly last year or so, another project in which I'm involved. I want to say a few things at the outset here. Civil War draft records are complex, confusing, and contradictory, and they vary from locality to locality. So what I'm going to say about Pennsylvania may not necessarily be true for Maryland or Ohio or any other state in the union, and it certainly will not be true for the southern states. And even within Pennsylvania, records and procedures vary from county to county. You'll see some of those as we go along. So the records are very local in orientation when you're trying to find somebody. But don't feel bad, because even the drafting officials themselves were confused. And it never ceased to amaze me when I was as I go through these records, the number of times that the provost marshals were running to Washington to get clear instructions on practices that conflicted from one district to another, and I can talk about that a little later. Again, this presentation applies only to Pennsylvania, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on York County since that's our interest here, and some surrounding counties. And one other thing I want to make sure you understand is just because a person's name was on a draft list does not mean that person was drafted or that person performed military service. The good thing for us is that many times individuals appear on draft lists that you don't find elsewhere. And when we did our publication, which I'll be talking about in a minute, of the 1862 enrollment lists, I found people on the enrollment list that don't show up in the 1860 census. So it's a nice, somewhat of a census substitute. Now, there is a lot that I could say about the draft, but this afternoon I'm mostly going to focus on the commonly used resources and how to find information about an ancestor. I will talk a little bit about the background of the draft, but my emphasis this afternoon is not on understanding the draft and all its complexities. I will explain a few things you need to know to use the records, but I'm going to focus mostly on the records themselves. And I'll be glad to take questions at any time. I've been dealing with this stuff for 40 years, so you won't throw me for a loop if you ask a question. I will be following the outline as we go along, because that way you'll see the things I'm talking about. And I try to put everything in the outline that you need. You know, URLs, books and so forth, so that you don't have to try to write it all down while going along. But I always tell people, if you're like me, you go home, you throw the handout in the drawer, and you probably never look at it again, right? I mean, just confess, that's what we do. What I always tell people is don't try to take a lot of notes. If you see something that's of interest to you as I go along, make a little star beside it and decide in your mind that when you get home, you're gonna at least check that one thing out. And that's normally the way I handle handouts from presentations. But I just want to start with some suggestions for background reading on the draft. What I call the 3 best books. On the left, you see James Geary's book, We Need Men, which talks about the Union draft in the North. And I'm only going to be talking about the Union draft, nothing about the Confederacy. I know nothing about the South. And I'll tell you right now, the situation in the South was completely different. So don't think that what I'm saying is going to apply if you have an ancestor who was subject to the draft in a Southern state. We Need Men is the most recent, most comprehensive, best book on the Civil War draft, particularly its political underpinnings, how it came about, how it developed, how it was implemented, and so forth. However, the middle book, an older book, 1 Million Men by Eugene Murdoch, does a better job of explaining exactly how the draft operated. So if you want to know what was the responsibility of a provost marshal, what was the responsibility of a surgeon, what was the responsibility of the board of enrollment, what was commutation like, what was substitution like, Eugene Murdoch's book is the best book. Geary does an excellent job overview. Murdoch focuses more on how the draft actually operated, or the drafts, I should say, and Murdoch has more information about Pennsylvania. Here, Geary's book is based on his doctoral dissertation, where he focused mostly on, I think, New York, Ohio, and I want to say Massachusetts. And when his book first came out, I was eagerly going through it, looking for stuff related to contract subjectors. He says a little bit about them, but not much. And so I sent him an email. And in my youth, I was rather snarky, I guess. And he sent me back a very kind email saying, well, he didn't cover Pennsylvania because he just didn't have time. And when you see what the records reveal, we understand why it takes so much time. Then on the right, you see James Lehman and Steve Nolt's book, Mennonites, Amish, and the American Civil War. This is the best book on content of subjectors in the Civil War. Although it deals primarily with Mennonites and Amish, it covers all of the non-Quaker peace churches pretty well. So there are references to the Brethren, which I'll talk about in a minute, the Church of Brethren, and so forth. And another nice thing about their book is they understand that the draft was implemented differently in different locations, and so they do it regionally as well, which makes their book very valuable. And if you do have Amish or Mennonite ancestors, they have lots of names in their book, so it's a good resource. Now, 2 other overviews I want to talk about for more local views of the draft. For Pennsylvania, and I wish this dissertation we put in print, it's conscription in Pennsylvania during the Civil War. You can see that it was done by William August Itter in 1941. Even though it was done in 1941, it is an excellent overview of how the draft worked in Pennsylvania. And it is available through various dissertation things online. If you want to understand how the draft worked in Pennsylvania, is an excellent piece. I have it on flash drive at home, so if you need a copy, just let me know, I can send it to you. The other thing I like about his dissertation is he refers to a lot of the draft records. So he probably looked, one time I looked at over 130 series of records in the federal draft system. He probably looked that many and more, and he footnotes those. He has those in the bibliography. So his dissertation is very helpful. And then for the York County situation, Mark Snell's dissertation or thesis on York County, which is available here in the History Center Library, does a good job of talking about how the draft was implemented in York County. And actually, it was his thesis that first alerted me to the wealth of information about individuals in the newspapers, which I will show you as we go along. So these are the background sources that you might want to use. I always like to remind people there really was no single Civil War draft, but a series of drafts within 2 major periods of conscription. The 1862 draft was conscription using the state militia systems, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then in 1863, the federal government enacted a conscription act which resulted in 4 draft calls between 1863 and 1865. And so the records are really set up in these by these 2 different categories: the state militia draft in 1862 and the federal drafts starting in 1863. And this is important to understand when you're trying to find records, because that tells you where the records will be found. So let's start with the 1862 militia draft. I just want to give you a little bit of background information on that. This was done under federal legislation, but the draft was carried out by the states through their militia systems. Enrollment started in August of 1862, and here in Pennsylvania, and the draft was conducted in October of 1862. According to the federal legislation, the draft ages were 18 to 45. Now, I told you there's a lot of confusion in draft records. Well, the Pennsylvania militia law said the minimum draft age was 21. When you look at draft records for this period, you're going to find sometimes the enrollers use the minimum age of 18, sometimes use minimum age of 21. So I always tell people, if you have somebody who was at least 18 years of age in 1862, check their draft records, even though they might not, may not have been there because of the Pennsylvania law. There were exemptions to the 1862 militia draft. There are certain occupations, such as public employees, postmasters, certain other occupations, and if you look at our publication, which I'll show you in a minute, it lists all the exemptions. Also, an individual could be exempted for physical or mental disability. Unnaturalized residents, people who are not citizens, were not subject to the draft, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And conscientious objectors under the Pennsylvania Constitution could be escape the draft. And of course, this is what my primary interest is. So you're going to see a lot of conscious objector stuff as we go along. Let's talk about research. What do you need to begin to get into the records of the 1862 militia draft? First of all, you need to know the full name of the ancestor. You need to know his age, as close as you can get to it. Because trust me, you may think your ancestor's name is unique, but it seems to me every time I do a search, there's 5 people with the same name in the same county, and the only way you can separate them is by occupation and age. And finally, what's very important is place of residence, because the records are divided by county and in some cases by municipality. So you want to know where the person lived. And therefore, I use the 1860 census a lot to at least get some idea of where the person was at. The place to start for the 1862 militia draft are with the county enrollment records. And here in York County, they're located at the county archives. They're called military enrollment books. And this is what a typical entry looks like, with the name, age, occupation, residence. Now, not all the townships did this, but some townships here in York County, they gave you a very specific location where the person lived, which is kind of fun. And then here, if the person was entered the service, and then any remarks or comments. And here you see this individual was in delicate health, so he was probably going to be exempted for physical reasons. Now, our society, thank you. Our society is in the process of transcribing and publishing these records. Here you see the most recent volume that's available, and hopefully volume 5 will be in your hands by the end of April. In the introduction to that book will be this breakdown of what will be in each volume. And this will show you the townships and municipalities that appear in each volume. So we've already done what we call Central York County, or York Borough, and Central York County, the townships kind of around the borough. Eastern York County we've done, Southern York County, and volume 5, which will be out at the by the end of April, will cover Chanceford's and Peach Bottom and Fallen townships. And you can see the other breakdowns there. Now, we're not the only county to have records like this. Over in Lancaster County, they have similar enrollment books. As you see, they give the same type of information: name, age, occupation, place of residence. But in Lancaster County, this is somewhat true in other counties, but Lancaster County in particular, you'll notice they also indicated religion. So here's one of the guys I'm really interested in, Henry Ginder. He was a dunker, actually, he was a river brother. And you see it says conscientious October 25th, 62. And so this is a very nice thing for me in my research on conscientious objectors. But dunkers and Mennonites are noted in some townships in Lancaster County.
Why are they lined out?
What's that?
Why is there a line for some?
Well, you see what this says here? Underage, conscientious, conscientious. Now you see the age here is 18. So that's lined out because they decided to go by the militia act or the state militia law rather than the federal law. And so even though under the federal law, he should have been subject to draft, under state law, he was not, and therefore they determined he was underage. Now you do not see this. I'll show you, go back to York County. I did not notice this in York County. So here's a 19-year-old. There's another 19-year-old. He's actually in the service. I have a great quote I'm going to show you at the end of the presentation about records, but just keep in mind, be more generous rather than less generous when you're looking at these records. And we find similar volumes in Franklin County. However, the interesting story here is in the 1880s, somebody in Franklin County got a hold of these from the, I guess, from the courthouse and donated them to the War Department. So now the Franklin County enrollment records for 1862 are held by the National Archives. When I was involved in one of my most recent research projects, I paid to have, there's 2 volumes from Franklin County. I paid to have both volumes scanned so I could have access to them at home. And now, thanks to my generosity, the National Archives put the images I paid for on their website. And you can go to I have a URL there. You can go right to that URL and you'll see the same thing that you're seeing here. It kind of makes me feel good, though, that I made some contribution to history at the federal level.
Did they give you credit, Jonathan?
No,
No.
they did not say that Jonathan Stair paid to have these scanned, but I am glad they put them online because now they'll be available to more people. I also provided the Franklin County Historical Society and Franklin County Archives a digital copy of this so that they have it available there as well. But if you want a copy, just let me know. I'll be glad to provide you a copy. I want to point out a couple of things here. You see it says CS here and where's the other here? SC here. Exempt CS means exempt conscientious scruple. C is a conscientious objector. Exempt SC means exempt surgeon certificate. Means it is exempted for physical reasons. It took me a little while to figure that out. And if you're not careful with transcribing these records, you put the wrong abbreviation. I did that a couple of times and caught myself. But you can see why I'm interested in these records because of all these references to conscientious scruples, because Franklin County was heavily settled by Mennonites and River Brother. Now, in addition to those county records, another resource for 1862 draft would be newspapers. And this is what Mark Snell's thesis put me onto. Here you see a clipping, just part of the clipping, just part of a clipping from the York Gazette listing the individuals who had been drafted in October of 1862. Now, keep in mind, this is a list of names of individuals whose papers or cards were pulled out of the draft wheel. This does not mean they actually served. It just means they were pulled out of the draft. If you do a name search on newspapers.com, you can get these names. I tried it and it works. So even if your ancestor's name is buried in here somewhere, usually the search function on newspapers.com will find it. There are, because the 1862 militia draft was a state operation, there are records at the Pennsylvania State Archives in Record Group 19, records of the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs. The first place that you want to look is this series called Records of Drafted Men and Substitutes. There, I believe that there are records for every county. And of course, within each county, as you can see here, they're broken down by township. I just pulled up Cador's Township. Actually, I had taken this because of this little phrase right here, conscientious scruples. But here you see another guy was exempted being over 45 years. And here, each municipality was assigned a quota, and he got exempted because he was in excess of the quota. And this man had provided a substitute. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go on here. But these records are found at the state archives, and in a minute I'll show you how you can get access to them free of charge at home, although not easily. Here's another record of draft amended substitutes. And again, this is Dover Township. Now you see it doesn't give us quite as much information as the last one, but again, it'll give you reasons for exemption over here. Conscientious. I think this is substitute 3 years, can be provided a substitute, not naturalized, and things like that. Now, as I mentioned, individuals who were not naturalized could seek exemption from the draft. The state archives has this file under the title, strange title, discharge orders and letters and notices of alien status. We just used to call them alien declarations. This is the petition of an individual in Berks County. He swears that he is a native of Prussia, that he was born in the province of Silesia in 1827, that he came to the United States in 1844, that he filed his intentions to become a citizen in 1859 in Berks County, Pennsylvania, that he has not yet been naturalized. Look at all the great information you can get from a document like this. It tells you where he came from, when he came to the United States, where he was living, and so forth, where he and his place of origin in Europe. During the 1862 draft, the Pennsylvania kept a register. You see here, register of aliens and persons having conscientious scruples against bearing arms. This register eventually was sent to the federal government and is now in the National Archives, but it does show you lists of individuals who were exempted for reasons of being aliens. I pulled the page for York County right here. The names, place of nativity, where they were living, and just when they applied for exemption and so forth. This is a National Archives record, and the State Archives has it on microfilm. The State Archives digitized the microfilm, and I was able to get a copy of the digital copy. So if you're interested in a copy of this, see me. I'll be glad to provide you with a copy of the digital copy of the microfilm. I need to figure out how to get this to the National Archives. So they put this on the website because this would be helpful as well. Now, one way to avoid the draft was to provide a substitute or have somebody serve in your stead. And the State Archives has a file of substitute depositions. In fact, my mother's great-grandfather, Levi Myers Ryder, had a farm, I think about 300 or 400 acres outside Elizabethtown during the Civil War. And he provided a substitute during this time period. I figured he was making too much money as a farmer and didn't want to go himself. Actually, I have, although all my ancestral families have been in Pennsylvania since colonial times, I have no direct ancestors who served in the Civil War, primarily because they were conscientious objectors, or in the case of Levi Myers Ryder, paid somebody to do their service. But here you see that Calvin Gerberick of East Hanover Township in Lebanon County is providing Franklin B. Shuey, who was a dentist, as his substitute. And Franklin's father, David, says, yeah, it's okay. He gives his consent for Franklin to serve in that capacity. Conscientious objectors, my favorite subject. I want to just briefly say a few things about conscientious objectors at this point. In 1862, the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1838 is still in effect. And Section 2 of Article 6 said that those who conscientiously scruple to bear arms shall not be compelled to do so, but shall pay an equivalent for personal service. So during the 1862 militia draft, the state decided that they would offer exemption to conscientious objectors if they filed a deposition. I just want to give you a sidebar here. You see, the Constitution says shall pay an equivalent for personal service, but never said what that fee was. So starting in the beginning of 1863, and I think it was in January when the legislature was in session, they started arguing about what should the equivalent for personal service be. Well, I think a bill passed the Senate. It was either a bill passed the Senate or House, but that body, the other body, could not agree on it. They were still haggling about it when federal law went into effect in 1863, just like our legislature today. Don't get too far with some things. So these men who filed depositions in 1862 never had to pay a dime to escape service. Who were conscientious objectors? They were primarily from what we call the historic peace churches, which I categorize in three major groupings: the Brethren, who were commonly known as Dunkers or Dunkers during the Civil War. They were more officially known as the German Baptist Brethren, now the Church of the Brethren. And this term, Dunkers or Dunkers, when you see it in draft records, could refer to Church of the Brethren, or could refer to what we also know as the River Brethren or the Brethren in Christ. And one of my current, what I'll talk about maybe later, one of my current projects, I'm trying to identify every man who was a Brethren in Christ draftee. I had a database of those that I'm working on. Then there's another large group that I call Mennonites, which include all the various Mennonite groups and the Amish. And finally, the Society of Friends of Quakers. These are all groups who were opposed to military service because of their understanding of the Bible. And so these are from the groups from which conscientious objectors came. There were some smaller groups such as the Schwenkfelders, and some Catholic orders also prohibited their members from serving in the military. The state provided these forms that individuals had to fill out, and this is again the deposition of my third great grandfather Adam Stair. You see that's his original signature right there. And it says that he consciously scruples to bear arms, believe it is unlawful to do so, whether in self-defense or in defense of his country, otherwise, howsoever, that the scruples and belief above stated have not been formed lightly, but carefully, deliberately, and conscientiously, and are now declared and professed not for the purpose of gaining military service of his country, but because he solemnly and religiously holds and maintains them. And that's the statement that they had to sign. And you see, as most peace churches did, they did not swear, but they affirmed it. AFFD says affirm. And just another interesting side note, when I became a state employee, I had to take an oath to uphold the Constitution of Pennsylvania, and you know what? I had to either swear or affirm. So that affirm comes from the Quaker background of not wanting to take an oath, and that's fluent in some of our things today. The idea of affirming rather than swearing. If an individual was determined to have good scruples, then they receive this notice saying that they were exempted because of conscientious scruples. That register that I mentioned earlier not only includes aliens, but also persons having conscientious scruples. And there's my ancestor Adam Stair and his brothers John, David, and Daniel. And actually, I'm related to about half the people on this page: the Richies, the Snyders, the Snowburgers. I have all those in my ancestry. And some of you may have recalled in January, I talked about Abraham Mellinger's barn up in Monaghan Township. His son, John Mellinger, was a River Brethren or Brethren in Christ minister, and his name appears in this register as well. This register, the names of conscientious objectors have been put into a database which is available on the Genealogical Society of Pennsylvania. And here you see the entries for my Stair relatives right here. So if you want to know, if you have a Mennonite, Amish, Quaker ancestor, you want to know if they were objectors in 1862, you can refer to this database. By the end of 1862, about 3,400 men claimed exemption as conscientious objectors here in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania, as far as I know, is the only state that had depositions like the ones I've been showing you, And also, Pennsylvania, of course, had the largest number of objectors of any state, north or south. Probably all the other states put together did not have as many objectors as Pennsylvania did, which for obvious reasons, because this was a center of particularly the Mennonites and the Brethren, and the Quakers had a large presence, particularly in the Philadelphia area. But the largest group of objectors, either in Pennsylvania or across the nation, would have been the Mennonites. The Quakers, I would say the Mennonites were the Quakers were the most politically active. When you study draft records, they're the ones that are going to Congress, they're the ones that are going to state legislature and say, hey, let's give a break to objectors. But the Dunkards or the Brethren are the ones that show up frequently in records because of their practice of baptism by immersion, particularly outside. And so it was noticeable as somebody was joining the church. And therefore, you find a lot of references to Dunkards in the draft records. Now, on your outline, you'll see a little asterisk before some of these series. The list of recommended substitutes, the substitutes depositions, the conference subjector depositions. The state archives microfilmed them, they then scanned the microfilm and they put them on the Power Library, and I have the URL there. However, I will caution you when you use the Power Library, I don't know if any of you try to use records on the Power Library, but it is like dealing with state or dealing with the IRS or something. I mean, I've tried, for instance, I was looking up some conscious subjective depositions. So I got started and it seems to start okay, but once you get into the images themselves, a lot of times they'll lock up after the second or third image and then you just can't go any further. I emailed the people who run the Power Library there, aware of the problem, and oh yeah, they're going to fix it. They've been fixing it for the last I don't know how many years. And I've emailed the state archives, and state archives would like to use a different platform, but they don't have the time and the money, so they're still using this. But they recognize that there's a problem. So you can use this, but just be aware it's going to take a lot of time and patience to look through the records on this website. I prefer to use the microfilm at the state archives when I can. So, you know, I might make a trip up there and check a number of things at one time. We've talked about the 1862 militia draft, and now we'll turn to the federal drafts under the Conscription Act of 1863. And again, like the 1862 draft, I'm going to give you some background and then talk about the records. You need to understand several pieces. Yes.
Can I ask you a quick question before you?
Yes.
So when looking at the books that you guys have been put together.
Yes.
We're getting the fifth volume. There are 8 total volumes of the plan. Would it be logical to say for the ones that haven't been done, just go to the military enrollment books? And for the ones that we have prepared and done such a good job with, is it even necessary to go to the military enrollment books?
Okay, for the books that we have done on the 1862 militia draft, our society has done, is it sufficient to look at the publication or should you look at the original? I would say use the publication as a guide. Some of our transcribers are sitting here. Margaret transcribed some. I did. Frank Grove did. Is anybody else here? Oh, Erica did. And trust me, we had difficulty sometimes interpreting the names. So I would say if you find a name that you think is close to what you want in the book, I would go check out the original and see what it shows you. I think, I forget what Christy told me if they're in the process of scanning those or not, but eventually I think they're going to put digital copies on their website of those. Frank.
The originals are the York County archive.
Right.
John,
Yes.
we didn't leave anything out what's in the originals. We did put everything in that's in the originals, but it was like you said.
Yes. Yeah, we tried to include every notation, even things that were crossed out, we put in with a line through them in the publication. But again, you're relying upon a human being to transcribe something that they saw. And like I said, these various people transcribed them. I proofread everything. And I'd still say check the original. There were some things, and if we absolutely could not determine what the name or the word was, I have a brackets with a question mark in it beside it. But always, as you're told in any genealogy class, consult the original to make sure that is what we say it said it was. And for those that have not been transcribed or that have not been published yet, yes, go out to the archives and see the original records. Just keep in mind, when you go out there, there's at least one, sometimes two books for each township. So it's not, it's not like you have the whole county. You have to know what township you want when you go there.
Well, thank you and excellent work by everybody.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm kind of proud of it, although we keep finding mistakes all the time, and that's why this next volume is a little slow coming out. My good proofreaders have found some errors that I made, so I appreciate that. Getting back to the federal draft. In March 3rd, 1863, Congress passed what was known as the Conscription Act, which established the federal draft and the bureaucracy. That was in place, and then in February of 1864, it was amended because they were finding out that they felt too many people were taking advantage of commutation, that is paying a $300 fee to escape service, and therefore they wanted to limit commutation. The February amendment also eliminated age classes, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the nice thing about the February 1864 amendment was it required very specific documentation from conscientious objectors. And then finally, in July of 1864, another amendment was passed, which limited commutation only to conscientious objectors. So if you say that your ancestor paid commutation after the July 4th, 1864 Act, most likely he was a conscientious objector. And sometimes it'll say that in the records and sometimes it will not, but that's something to keep in mind. Now, if you forget all of that, don't worry about it. When you find something, just take notes and you'll figure it out as you go along. The Conscription Act established two draft classes. This was based upon age. Class 1 was comprised of men who were ages 20 to 35 and single men 36 to 45. And Class 2 consisted of married men ages 36 to 45. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, as you'll see in some of the records, they're divided by class. And secondly, if your ancestor was in this second class, he was less likely to be drafted than the people in the first class. So if your ancestor was between 36 and 45, he was less likely than if it was in that age group. There were exemptions under the federal law. What I call hardship on family, like the only son of aging parents, or the only son of a widowed mother who had multiple children to support and so forth. So there were certain what I call family hardships. Also, if a person was physically or mentally unfit, and this exemption was used quite a bit. In fact, as you'll see, my own ancestor Adam Stair was exempt in 1865 for feebleness of constitution. A third way to get out of the draft was to provide a substitute, just as the 1862 draft had. You could hire somebody, and the price of substitutes was not set, so it was whatever you could purchase somebody's service for. Usually, it was at least $100. In some cases, people were paying as high as $2,000 for a substitute. Keep in mind that the commutation fee was $300. $300 was about a person's annual income during the Civil War. So if you're paying $2,000 for a substitute, you're paying a lot of money. And their substitution became a big problem. They're what they called substitute brokers, who would go and round up usually unnaturalized immigrants, who could, particularly ones who couldn't speak English, take them to a camp, and then they would start selling them off to people to be their substitutes. And Mr. Eugene Murdoch, who wrote the book 1 Million Men, wrote another book about the whole substitute and bounty situation and how it was abused and so forth. And then the Federal Draft Act also allowed escape by paying a $300 commutation fee, and it did set the fee at $300 because they felt that that way, in theory, anybody could get out of the draft if they paid that amount of money. But again, that was a lot of money for the average working person. However, I will say this, that when the draft first started, communities, and I haven't checked this out for York, but I've seen this over in Lancaster County, communities would put together like a community chest. And they would collect enough money so that they could pay the commutation fee for the men who were drafted from their borough or their township or whatever. And some of the churches did this as well. I think the Mennonites in particular were collecting money to help members of their congregations escape the draft. This is a index to exemption certificates from the 16th district, which is the district next to us, Adams County, west to Somerset County. And I show this because here you see the exemptions. Only son, that's a family hardship. Medical, physical disability, alienage. So that person was not a citizen. What else do we have here? In service. This guy was in service. There was one here, substitute, he had a substitute service down here. So these are different ways that individuals were got some exemption from this draft act. I mentioned the value of James Geary's book, We Need Men. This is one of my favorite parts in the book, this chart. Because over here, just look at the totals. This is a total number of men whose names were pulled from these draft boxes or drums. This is what he started with. By the time everything was said and done, they actually took into service 46,347. That is about 5% of that total. Geary says in his book that a man had a 1 in 100 chance of being taken into service if he was drafted. And here's why. Well, first of all, you can get the people who did not report, who were discharged, and then get down. This is the number that were actually examined by the local boards of enrollment. And look how many of those were given disability exemptions. My ancestor Adam Stair's brother David Stair was exempted for loss of all his teeth in his upper jaw. So he never got married, so I figured he must have been a pretty ugly looking guy. But you know why he was exempted? Because they required a recruit to have teeth in both jaws so they could bite the end off a cartridge. And I found this is disturbing, but I found a document when I was doing research this past year. I heard it was some municipality in the 16th district, which is west of here. Men were found to be pulling their own teeth out so that they could escape the draft. I thought, what a painful way. I don't know if I do that, but so that was one way you can get a disability exemption. All other exemptions. So even if we look at held to service, these are the people who got through all these steps. We still only have about a third of the ones who initially drawn. Then we get down to those who paid commutation or furnished a substitute. And finally, we get this final number down here. And you notice, if you look at the paid commutation, how the number goes down, that's a reflection of the impact of these amendments to the draft law. So probably these 460 men who paid commutation in December 1864, probably all of them were conscientious objectors. Now, there are a lot of exceptions to that, which I'm not going to go into, but that's just sort of a general rule of thumb. There was a direct exemption for conscientious objectors. And as I mentioned earlier, the 1864 amendment required that an objector have a declaration of his conscientious scruples against bearing arms, which shall be supported by satisfactory evidence. And so they started requiring more documentation, such as this item, which I found at Juniata College. The documentation was supposed to verify they were a member of a peace church and that their principles, that they held to their principles throughout their lives. And here you see, we the undersigned elders and deacons of the German Baptist Redemptor Church of Indian Creek, this is in Montgomery County, certify herewith that John Bechtel of Southern Township is a member of our fraternity, so that he meets that qualification. He was a member of the church and is well established in the articles of our faith, which are known to be strictly non-resistant in practice and principle. He is therefore conscientiously opposed to the bearing of arms and craves exemption from such service according to the provision of the law. And sometimes they'll even tell you how many years the person was a member of the church. But a document like this was required after the February 1864 amendment to the Draft Act. One other item I want to talk about under background of these federal drafts is the Board of Enrollment. The local drafts were operated by the Board of Enrollment, which consisted of a provost marshal who was an Army veteran who held the rank of a captain of cavalry. He was assisted by a surgeon, a doctor, and then a local citizen. And this is where you get some very interesting correspondence, because there's always questions about who that local citizen should be. And one provost marshal suggested that the local citizen should be a man who was too old to be drafted, but who was popular in the community, so he kind of greased the skids for the draft process. One of Pennsylvania's most notorious provost marshals was none other than Thaddeus Stevens Jr., who was the nephew of Thaddeus Stevens, the congressman, the very important congressman. And the congressman probably got his nephew his job. Thaddeus Stevens had been in the service. He had been wounded, and I think his father died, and he became the ward of his uncle, Thaddeus Stevens, the congressman. And I think the congressman decided he'd like to make sure his nephew stays alive, and got him a job as the provost marshal in Lancaster County in 1864. That's a story that needs to be studied and written more about. There's a lot more into it than we'll even tell you. So where do you start with the federal draft records? Again, the same information needed as the state militia draft. You need a full name of the ancestor, the age of the draftee, and the place of residence. And again, it's very important to know the place of residence. Why? Because Pennsylvania, as all the northern states, were divided into draft districts according to the congressional districts. And you see York County was in the congressional district with Cumberland County, the 15th district. Adams County was in the 16th district. This is one I've done a lot of research in because there's Bedford County, where my ancestors lived. Lancaster County was populous enough to have its own congressional district and its own draft district. So you can use this map. I have a list on the back page of your handout that lists the draft districts and the divisions. Because Pennsylvania was so large, it was decided, and populations decided to divide the draft districts into two divisions. The Eastern Division, which consisted of districts 1 through 12, and the headquarters for the Eastern Division was in Philadelphia. And the Western Division consisted of districts 13 through 24, and its headquarters was in Harrisburg. I'll talk a little bit more about the importance of that later on, but just so you understand this, because the records are arranged according to these districts and divisions. Each district, let's just take York County. York County and Cumberland and Perry County have been divided into sub-districts, which were primarily based upon municipality. So a municipality may have been a sub-district, or part of a municipality may have been a sub-district. Where do I start? Where else but Ancestry.com, right? That's where we start all of our genealogy research. But this is the best place to start if you're doing research on the draft records of the 1862 or 1863 federal draft. There you will find what are called consolidated enrollment lists. And I give you the information for the references at the National Archives, because the National Archives also has some of these on their website. So if you want to use them free of charge, you can go to the National Archives website. However, they don't have all the name indexes that Ancestry does. And here you see the entry for my ancestor, Adam Stair. And you'll notice it talks about the 16th district. That's his draft district. Here you see class 2. And that's important because you see this is volume 3 of a series. Well, volumes 1 and 2 for the 16th district had names from classes, the first class, and in volume 3 was the second class. And of course, Adam Stair was in there because he was 39 years old, so he fit in that older group. Here's the entry for York County showing John Mellinger again. And you probably can't read this, so I'm going to blow this up for you. John Mellinger, exemption on conflict of scruples. So not only did he seek exemption as a constitutional objection in 1862, he also saw the exemption for that in 1863. And again, you'll see that he's in class 1. And this is the 15th district. York County was in the 15th district. The federal draft records are housed at the National Archives under Record Group 110, which are records of the Provost Marshal General's Bureau. You go to their website, and there's various ways that you can find listings of the records And I would like to talk about a few of the finding aids that I have used that I find most helpful. And so we're going to go through those now. In 1967, the National Archives printed a preliminary inventory of the records. And here you can see my page. I scanned the page, one of the pages I used from York County. If I circle it, that was something of interest to me. If I put check mark, that means I actually looked at the record. This is outdated. It's no longer in print. However, you can find it through the National Archives website if you go to the URL that I have there. I gave you the very specific URL and frame number, so you go right to the images for this particular document, because there are multiple documents when you go to that particular URL. The reason I like this inventory is because, first of all, it breaks the records for Pennsylvania down by draft district. This is page from the 15th district. And also it gives you a lot of notations about the records, including something that was not used later on, the original volume numbers. Now, these are not going to mean anything to you initially, but as you get into these records, it's helpful to know how these may have been arranged originally, because sometimes you see this is number 17 up here. So originally number 17 was on the shelf right beside number 18. And therefore, there might be some relationship between those two. And I continue to find this particular inventory helpful. I have my copy up here on the table if you want to take a look at it. The National Archives has reorganized and re-inventoried all this stuff, and here is their database of the entire record group 110. You can get a copy of this database from them, or I'll be glad, I have a copy of it on my computer, and I'll be glad to send you a copy. I got this from the National Archives branch of Philadelphia. And I would say this: if you are going to deal with the National Archives, deal with the people in Philadelphia first. They're a lot more helpful. That's a lot smaller, a lot easier. I think it's a lot easier to use, a lot more accessible. And most of the records you need will be in Philadelphia, not down in Washington, D.C. So they were the ones who kind of provided this. They got all excited. When I started going down there every week, they were all excited to see me. And the guard got to know me on a first name basis. And sometimes he didn't even frisk me. He knew me so well. But this will give you the important thing about this. This spreadsheet is. This NAID number is their current identification number that we use. So you need to know that when you're having these records pulled. PH means Philadelphia, and then this is the individual record number at Philadelphia. But if you could expand this out, you get the full title, whatever it is in these records. I just wanted to make you aware of this. Now, another thing that they've done, which is very nice, is they've done a Word document which lists all the records for Pennsylvania. And this is another thing that they can provide, and that with National Archives Philadelphia can provide. You get it from me. And again, this is broken down by draft district. So this will tell you this 9th district is Lancaster County. This will tell you the types of records you can expect to find. Here's the number from the old inventory, and here's the new number, the NAID number that you need. The nice thing I like about this, it tells you what, like two containers, one container. This will give you an idea of what you can expect when you go to National Archives as far as what amount of material you're going to get. Because when you go to the National Archives in Philadelphia, they only allow you to have one cartload at a time. So you kind of have to figure out how much can I fit on a cart to have pulled. So what types of records can you expect to find in the National Archives? Well, most of the things you want to look for will be in the records of the various draft districts. And just to remind you that the draft districts correspond to the congressional districts, and you can use that chart that I have in the handout, or if you go to this website, this is actually a website for congressional and state legislative elections, but it has these nice districts in there. This is one of the records. You'll see on your handout, I have lists like descriptive record books, medical registry, correspondence, and so forth. I kind of try to put them in the order that you might want to check them first. So if you're looking for an individual, you want to start with the descriptive books, like you see here. Now, unfortunately, it's not too clear. It gives a man's name, age, height, color of eyes, color of hair, I think, some other information about the individual, including what I was looking for. This is after, you see it, this was called July 18th, this is after the July 1964 amendment. And now they're paying the commutation because they are non-combatants. It was in these records that I found information about my ancestor Adam Stair in a descriptive book of the 16th district. In 1865, he was noted to be 44 years of age, 5 feet 11 inches tall, blue eyes, gray hair, fair complexion. He was a farmer, lived in Bedford County, and he was exempted for feebleness of constitution. Now, some of the servants were known for being very generous in Pennsylvania and probably exempting more people than they should have. But Adam Stair died the following year in 1866. So I'm pretty sure he probably was a pretty sickly man. In fact, in the 1860 census, he has a tenant farmer on his property. He probably wasn't doing too well farming by himself. And that came out of the descriptive books. And you'll find similar information in the medical registries. Medical registers are essentially just the books that the servants fill out as they're examining the draftees. Now, you will also find correspondence files and endorsements. Endorsements are letters that an office did not keep. They just wrote notes from the back and they sent the letter either on to another office or they sent it back to the original office. And they made a note about the endorsement in a book. But these can give you some good information. I found lots of neat information in the endorsements as well as the correspondence. I'm going to read this one because you probably can't read it too well. Let's start here. That the family of the within Solomon Smith, consisting of a wife and 4 children, the oldest being 15 years of age, reside with the mother of said Smith, that she's now 66 years of age and owns about 3 acres of land with a small log house erected thereon. And the family represent that the land is difficult to cultivate and is not very productive. Citizens of York County represent that said Solomon Smith has $300 on interest, that he had been frequently advised to enter the service as a volunteer and secure the bounty, but refused to do so, and always showed a disposition to play sick, and depended upon that course to escape military duty. I forget this. This Smith, I believe, was either in Dover or Hopewell Township. I forget which one. So obviously, they thought that Mr. Smith could do service, but he was trying to escape the draft otherwise. And then other times in correspondence files and endorsements, you find other interesting things that are somewhat tangentially related to draft, because the provost marshals were also involved in apprehending deserters and taking care of some military related issues in the various districts. This is, and I think that, oh no, this is not the one that Scott Davis might have his book, but this is an interesting one. This is from Carlisle. Endorsement on the petition of Manuel Murtaugh, Company 2nd Pennsylvania Artillery, who asked to be discharged from the service to contribute to the support of his family. The petition sets forth that the wife of Murtaugh has been seduced by a man named Paul Sowers, and that it's necessary that he be at home to take charge of his 2 children, who by reason of the seduction of their mother are left without a proper home. That's an interesting sidelight on your ancestor, like this one. This is the one I think, I didn't check, but I think Scott Mingus might have this in one of his books. This is the statement of Isaac Thistle, September 29th, 1863. On the date's important, September 29th, 1863. Keep in mind what was happening in York County in 1863, all right? He says, I'm about 30 years of age. I live in Montague Township, York County. I was drafted last fall and reported at York and was there about 2 months and left on furlough to come home and do my butchering. My uniform and equipments are safe. I think the blanket and knapsack are Bosch's near York. They were put there by Peter Ginter. I was in the 166th Regiment. Peter Ginter is now at home at Siddonstown, which is now Siddonsburg. He was drafted and served his time. When the rebels were in York County, I did go with them a little piece, but I was drunk. I went with the rebels from Siddonstown, York County to above Grants Bridge in Cumberland County. I think this was the same time the rebels shelled Carlisle. And he was being accused of being a rebel sympathizer and showing the Confederates the route through York County. And his excuse was, well, I was home on leave and I got intoxicated. I didn't know what I was doing. So this was in the draft records. Now, the reason these images are so bad is because I was just snapping pictures on my cheap digital camera, because I was intending to transcribe some of these for a newsletter. And then when Richard asked me this presentation, I thought, well, I'll show some of these things so you get an idea what they look like, although the clarity isn't the best. So those are records that you'll find at the draft district level, at the local level. So for York County, that would be the records you find in the 15th district, Lancaster County, the 9th district. I think I have some of the districts listed there in the outline itself. The next level up, next level of administration was the division. And as I mentioned, Pennsylvania had two divisions, the Eastern Division and the Western Division. The Eastern Division office was in Philadelphia, the Western Division office was in Harrisburg. And by a decision of the federal government, if a state had two divisions, the division office that was in the state capital was considered the headquarters for the state. So the office in Harrisburg not only was the headquarters for the Western Division, it was also considered the draft headquarters for the entire state. That is important because if you're doing research in the Eastern Division and you're in one of these counties, particularly like Lancaster or Lebanon, since they're closer to Harrisburg, a lot of times people who had problems went to Harrisburg rather than send their stuff all the way to Philadelphia. And I found stuff in the Eastern Division in the Western Division records. So that's if you're going to get into divisional records, just something to keep in mind. And part of that guide that I showed you earlier from the National Archives does break down the division records as well. Generally, divisional records refer to the same matters as what you'll find in district records, although it might be just a higher level of decision making. However, I did stumble upon a thing or two at the division record level, and I'll just show you an example here. This is an entry in a register of letters received. This is referred to the Provost Marshal General affidavit of Mary E. Talbert, dated Hopewell Township, York County, Pennsylvania, October 19, 1864. That her husband, Jeremiah Talbot of Company I 184th Regiment Pennsylvania Volunteers, came home on furlough, sick in August last. And that on or about the 1st of September, Martin Saylor and others in the borough of York, Pennsylvania, having furnished him with citizens' clothing, induced him to enlist as a substitute, and then defrauded him of a portion of his bounty and etc. Endorsement from this office. And so what they're saying is this poor guy came home with furlough. He somehow got separated from his uniform, and so somebody else convinced him that he could go in as a substitute and get the bounty that was being paid. They took, of course, his money. He ended up with nothing. Those are the types of things. There's probably something that started at the district level and was referred up to the Western Division. The highest level of federal draft records would be those of the central office in Washington, D.C. And this administered all of the federal draft across all the states. And usually only the most important or most difficult cases got referred up to the central office. And again, if you find something in these records, it's most likely there's a paper trail in the lower levels at the district and divisional levels. So you don't necessarily have to go to Washington to get all this stuff, but sometimes you find great stuff there. Particularly if an original letter was filed with the district, the provost marshal then referred to the divisional level then referred to the central office. It's kept on sending the original letter along. You might find the original letter in Washington, even though you find references to it in the lower levels. And here's one that I thought would appeal to genealogists. You notice this is Lewis Berry, York County. Isaac Garrettson apparently was a local tattletale, and he states that George Hoops has been exempted from the draft upon the false representation of his parents that he is under 20 years of age. Evidence was offered to the Board of Enrollment to prove that he was over 20 years, but they did not call for it. Now, if you look over here, I'm going to enlarge this to show you what this says. This is what makes the heart of genealogists glad. It says one of their defenses was the case of George Hoops was decided upon all the evidence before the board and the requirements of Form 30 complied with. A certified extract from the family record, great, under oath, there being no legal registry, was required, from which it appeared George Hoops was born December 22nd, 1843. If a fraud was practiced upon the board, it was by willful perjury. So what they're saying is the family came in and said, hey, we have this family registry that shows his birth is this. And I think this is from the provost marshal, yeah, provost marshal's office in Carlisle. The provost marshal saying, well, if the family registry was fake, it was the family's fault. They provided false evidence. And here's the name of George Hoops in a draft list in the newspaper. But you find a lot of times in these draft records references to family records. So if you're looking for an exact birthday of an ancestor, you might find it in the draft records. Yes.
The newspaper listing, are they gonna list the people before they got a substitute?
Yes, so I should say, it's hard to say, most of the time, yes. Not always, generally, I was gonna talk about that a little later, but I'll talk about that right now. Generally, the lists of the individuals whose names appear in the newspaper are lists of men whose names were drawn, they usually put a piece of paper or cards in a drum, turned it, and they pulled them out. And so this would be a list of names that would be advertised as people who had been pulled, names had been pulled for the draft. And after that point, then they could provide a substitute or seek a physical exemption or whatever, or pay commutation. While I was knocking around in the correspondence files of the central office, so this is the big wheels down in Washington, I found this very interesting letter from Adams County. I'll start over here. The undersigned, who is S. Henry or Samuel Henry, the undersigned, pastor of St. John's, St. Mary's, and St. Lutheran's congregations in and near Littlestown, Adams County, Pennsylvania, has been drafted in the 16th Enrollment District and is under order to report at Chambersburg on the 6th of April next. I have been 15 years a minister and am now in the active discharge of duties of my office. I respectfully request that I be paroled for a period of 1 year. I think it proper to state that my congregations are large and that my enforced absence from them would deprive them in the neighborhood of a large proportion of their facilities of public worship. This is a letter from the pastor of those churches over in Adams County requesting to be exempted from the draft. And guess who supports his request? None other than Edward McPherson, the congressman from Adams County who owned the McPherson barn on the Gettysburg battlefield. And what does he say? He said, I was a schoolmate of the advocate, Reverend Samuel Henry of Littlestown, Pennsylvania, and knew him to be a minister of the Lutheran Church in an important field of labor. He has a young family and 3 congregations. I consider his application to be reasonable and proper, and therefore respectfully recommend it be granted. So how can you not have success if you have a congressman supporting your petition? And I think he was eventually, he eventually escaped the draft, because you can see the date is March of 1865. Of course, the war ended in April. However, I will say this: the draft records continued on into the fall of 1865. So if you don't find something during the war period, I would at least check up through the middle of the summer of 1865. Now, we talked about newspapers, and you will find names of individuals who were drafted under the federal drafts in the newspaper. I wanted to see if this really works. Some of my wife's ancestors were Stouts, and I thought, well, Stout was a good York County name, and probably one of them was subject to the draft. And sure enough, here you see Abraham Stout here, George Stout up here. I just put in the surnames in newspapers.com and selected the county of York, and I came up with this. So I figured if Stout is buried here and up here, and there's an Adam Stout, that probably the search function on newspaper.com works pretty well. So newspapers would give you another source of information on this draft. And here is my ancestor's name, Adam Stair. This was when he was drafted and exempted for being having feebleness of constitution. Of course, you can see the Bedford newspaper was not a big fan of the draft. Tickets to the inauguration ball, as they say. I just want to conclude to remind you that you might find draft records in other places, historical collections and private papers. You know, look in college archives, there might be some stuff here. I didn't really check the York County History Center to see if they had anything in private papers, but it'd be another place to look. particularly if your ancestor was a member of a peace church, denominational publications and records may be helpful. I mentioned I've been doing a database of Brethren in Christ, Civil War draftees, and their newspaper called the Evangelical Visitor, even though it was published after the Civil War, is helpful because when a person died, they had usually a pretty nice obituary in there, and sometimes it'll tell you how long the person was a member of the church and whether or not they had non-resistant principles during the war. And occasionally you'll find references to individuals in published histories and secondary works like Knowlton Layman's book, and even Murdoch's book has some individual names in it. I want to close with two quotations from James Geary's book, which apply to research in these records. He has a very nice summary at the back of his book about how he did research in these records. We just looked at record group 110. He says it is imperative to have a general research plan in place and to do as much preliminary research as possible before visiting the National Archives. And I would urge you to do that. Get as much information about your ancestor as you can before you go there, so you know exactly what you're looking for. And then he says, this experience, the experience of putting together his book and using these records, merely reaffirms the maxim that a researcher in 19th century records can never assume that a source does not exist simply because it's not where it is supposed to be located. Keep that in mind. Because it's just like I was talking about the Eastern and Western divisions. Just because a person lived in the Eastern division doesn't mean you're not going to find records about them in the Western division. And so in the draft records in particular, sometimes you find things in surprising places. Well, I think it's time to cut it off here. So I'll close with that, and I'll be glad to take any questions or comments you might have at this time. Yes.
Jonathan, with the draft records occurring in August of 1862, if someone enlisted before that point, obviously they wouldn't be in any of this. You would only find, and this would be, say, in Lancaster County, throw that out. You would just look for their information, and maybe I found them in tax records where it says they're all, I forget the wording they use, but they're not present for the tax, and it's implied they're off in the war, and no tax was assessed to them. But other than looking up war records of where they served, and something of that nature, where they were mustered in, this is not going to help for someone like that.
On the contrary, look right here. Their individuals gives you the date they enlisted, company and regiment. Now this is York County. I'm not sure how it's, like I said, it might vary from county to county. York County did this. There's evidence of it in Franklin County as well. And so, yes, I would check these records.
So they did record on here.
Yes.
People that had already enlisted.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Great presentation.
Walter, do you have a question?
Yes. If the substitute bounty person didn't work out, did the original draft person have a problem that he's going to deal with?
Remember, I said the provost marshals themselves were always confused about how to deal with that. That was one of the problems they ran into. Somebody hires a substitute. They send them off to the camp where they're going to be inducted in service. Substitute gets there, immediately deserts, and you don't have that person. Now what do? So some provost marshals said, well, the person has to find somebody else. Other provost marshals said, well, you already provided a substitute. It's not your fault. And there were a lot of questions about that, a lot of concerns. And it really, I would say it was on a case-by-case basis how it worked out. And that's one thing I want to say about these records in general. Each person's experience probably was different, so you need to follow a particular person at a time if you want to get this full story on an individual. Now, when I was doing research, I was researching conscientious objectors as a whole, and so I was following that particular line, but it did not give me a good sense of what a particular individual did. Well, I did follow Adam Stair through all of the records, but he, as you saw, was exempted for being sickly. But depending upon an individual situation, you can find all types of nuances and differences in records, even for individuals who were from the same area and had some of the same experience. So for instance, recently I encountered under the, I think it was the February 1864 amendment, an objector could go into like hospital service instead of paying the commutation fee or instead of providing a substitute. Well, I found a case where one man, I think it was in 1864, early 1865, claimed to be an objector. And he said, I want to serve in a hospital. The provost marshal wasn't quite sure what to do with him. So the provost marshal sent him to Carlisle Barracks. So he was held at Carlisle Barracks, and I didn't get the full story, follow the whole story through, but the sense I got was he probably never made it to the hospital. They just held him in Carlisle Barracks. They were tossing back and forth what they should do with him. However, I found another case, I think it was Somerset County, two guys, I believe they were either Amish or Mennonites, said they wanted to go into hospital service, and they did eventually end up serving or being sent to the hospital in Philadelphia to work. So there's two people sort of same situation, but have different outcomes. So your ancestor's situation might be different than anything else you'll find. And that's why these records are so fun to get into, because you're uncovering a different new story every time you get into the records. Yes,
Is there
Tom.
a standard price to pay a substitute?
No, there was no set fee, which was another problem. Because, you know, as the war went on, as substitutes became hard to get, prices went up. Or you could pay what they call a substitute broker. You say you pay him $500, and he will promise to get you a substitute for that amount. But he might actually only hire somebody for $300 and make $200 profit off of it. And there were a lot of concerns about the substitute brokers, and fees were all over the place and going crazy. So no, there was no set fee.
John.
Yes.
Was there, maybe you couldn't find this, but was there any kind of a stigma held against the conscientious objectors or substitutes, you know?
Let me tell you a story about that. In 1990, I went to a conference on the 50th anniversary of the enactment of the Selective Service Act, which was enacted in 1940. And I was sitting around the table with a bunch of all these World War II conscientious objectors, which was a great experience. And I'm glad I did it when I did, because a lot of those guys aren't around anymore. And this question came up, and there was one professor from a local university said, oh yeah, you know, they were persecuted and so forth, and it was terrible for them. In my research, all I can say is generally in Pennsylvania, objectors, sometimes the newspapers would say some nasty things about them, but they generally did not suffer any kind of physical persecution. There were some Quakers that refused to do anything. They refused to pay the commutation fee. They refused to provide a substitute. They refused to put on uniform, and they were held in Philadelphia. And I think it was the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting or one of the monthly meetings in that area was working to get them out of there. But one of the people in that group reported back to the Quaker group that's trying to help them, saying he felt they were treated fairly. So you have to keep in mind, Pennsylvania has a long tradition of peace church activity, peace church members. And so there was not quite the animus against peace church members in Pennsylvania as you might find elsewhere. The Mennonites and Brethren in the South had a very bad time. In fact, some of them ended up coming up into Pennsylvania, and some of them ended up going up into Canada. And so, you know, Pennsylvania was not a bad place. In fact, Lehman in their book note that in Lancaster County, particularly Mennonites, were serving in public positions. I think a Mennonite was a county commissioner. They were serving in some of the local or public offices. So it's not like they were totally withdrawn from the political situation. And the Mennonites and Brethren pretty much were Republicans. And so the Republican administrations, Curtin and the state capital was Republican, Lincoln was Republican, and they were always trying to kind of curry favor with these people because those who voted would almost always vote Republican, which is kind of interesting. And I think Mark Snell says in his thesis that York County, most people were voting Democratic at the time. In fact, I think in both presidential elections, York County went against Lincoln. Is that correct? Does anybody know that? So no, there's not any kind of widespread persecution of them. I would say about a third of my Civil War area ancestors were conscientious objectors. There are no stories in my family about people suffering anything. And as you can see, most of them were able to get exempted from service one way or the other.
New York County did go against.
Yes, I thought so. So, yes, Mindy,
Regarding the commutation fee,
yes.
were those funds ear tagged for any special purpose?
Well, that was another bone of contention all through the war. Where was the money going? And that's why some peace churches said, we're not going to pay the commutation fee because we're pretty sure it's going to fund purchase of substitutes, or go to raise bounties for enlistment and so forth. Other times, the government was telling them, well, we're using the money to pay for hospitals and stuff like that. And there was all kinds of problems. Again, it's one of those things that was confusing, complex, and read those books to find out all of the different things that happened. But no, you couldn't always be sure where the $300 was going to go to. I mean, theoretically, the idea was the $300 would go pay somebody else to serve in your place, but that's not how it worked.
If you did alternative service, would you also have to pay a fee?
No, if you were willing to work in a hospital, that's what, if you want to call that alternative service, you do not have to pay the commutation fee. That's why those two guys from Somerset County took that option.
Were there non-combatant positions in the military?
Not that I'm aware of, other than working in the hospitals. Usually the references I've seen, they talk about, and usually the hospitals were not on the front, but they were like in Philadelphia, or I think they might have sent some to Washington, DC, but they were not hospitals that were on the front. Well, I'm sorry I went so long, but you see, I'm kind of enthusiastic about this subject, and never want to get me started on this subject. Okay, with that, our meeting's adjourned.